Donald Trump has added more fuel to the fire by intensifying his crackdown against Somalis in America.
Operation Metro Surge continues this morning, but with fewer federal agents.
Minneapolis St. Paul was shaken when federal agents launched Operation Metro Surge, a huge immigration and fraud crackdown in late 2025.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars, billions, every year.
Social media exploded with wild rumors about secret networks and billion-dollar scams. But what's the real story behind the chaos? Could the truth be far more surprising than anyone imagined? Join us as we uncover what happened. The raid that stopped Minneapolis cold. Right in the heart of Minneapolis, something unfolded that instantly caught the attention of the whole country. What started as a typical morning for many families turned into a moment of stun and confusion when federal law enforcement officers began arriving in large numbers across the city and its neighboring town, St. Paul. The quiet streets that people took for granted became places where strangers in uniforms appeared at doors, in neighborhoods, and near shops, creating a sense of tension that residents had never felt before. This wasn't the usual police activity. This was a federal operation so large that people compared it to a storm sweeping through town. The US Department of Homeland Security, including agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, said they were launching what they called the largest immigration enforcement operation ever in Minnesota. In simple terms, this meant hundreds, and by some reports, thousands of federal officers had been sent into the Twin Cities area with orders to carry out arrests, checks, and enforcement actions that focused on immigration status. It looked different from what most locals had seen before. Agents wearing tactical gear, moving in groups, and using their authority in ways that felt overwhelming to communities that weren't used to being the center of a federal crackdown. Almost immediately, people in neighborhoods with large immigrant populations began to feel uneasy. Families watched from windows as agents walked streets that had once been familiar and safe. Some parents held children close, whispering reassurances that everything was okay, even though their hearts were pounding with worry. Others stood outside, trying to process what this meant for them. Would they be stopped? Would someone they knew be taken away? Would their normal life suddenly change without warning? The fear was real, and it spread like wildfire through the community. Local business owners felt it too. In districts where small shops and markets had served as gathering places for neighbors and friends, regular customers suddenly stayed away. People didn't want to risk being seen or questioned. Somali American shopkeepers, whose stores had bustled with life and laughter, now watched their foot traffic dwindle. What used to be cheerful greetings and familiar faces became quiet aisles and empty sidewalks. Many worried they might not survive the economic blow, especially in winter months when business was already slower. Officials said the operation was not random. Federal authorities linked their activities to broader concerns, including immigration law enforcement and a long-running investigation into alleged fraud in federal programs within Minnesota. They pointed to past cases where large amounts of taxpayer money were misused in programs intended to help those in need, and they said the federal government was determined to follow up on leads and evidence linked to those investigations. These were serious issues. Governments cannot ignore fraud and misuse of public funds, and so federal agents said their presence was part of a legal effort to enforce rules and bring accountability where it was due. Still, for many people living in the Twin Cities, the arrival of ICE was about more than law enforcement letters and policy language. It felt personal. In some corners of the city, parents whispered to each other about how they had taught their children to stay inside if strangers came to the door. Grandparents watched grandchildren play quietly in yards, praying that normal life could return soon. Friends shared worried messages on phones, urging each other to stay safe and close. People who had lived in the United States for decades, some as citizens, some on protected status, some with legal visas, felt uncertainty creep into every part of their day. Tension mounted when state and local leaders spoke out. The governor of Minnesota and the mayor of Minneapolis both expressed deep concern about what they saw unfolding on city streets. They argued that the federal operation was creating fear, confusion, and division, and that it was disrupting daily routines, from kids going to school to workers going to their jobs. Some local officials even filed a lawsuit, saying the federal actions violated constitutional rights and went too far beyond what immigration enforcement should look like. Their words echoed the feelings of many residents who felt powerless watching heavy-handed actions play out in their neighborhoods. Meanwhile, federal authorities defended their operation, insisting that they were following laws passed by Congress and that their aim was to enforce immigration statutes and investigate serious allegations of fraud. They said they were not targeting people based on ethnicity or nationality, but rather on evidence and legal criteria. Still, the imagery of masked agents walking through familiar streets was jarring for anyone who had never seen such things before in their hometown. As the days went on, the headlines kept coming. People in Minneapolis and across the United States saw stories about protests forming in city squares, families gathering to support each other, and courtroom battles playing out behind closed doors. What began as a sudden and surprising arrival of federal agents quickly turned into a movement of voices demanding clarity, fairness, and answers about what this operation meant for everyday people. The situation was no longer just an enforcement action. It had become something that touched the hearts and minds of neighbors, friends, and families across the community. And just when many thought they had seen the full picture, something else emerged. A deep narrative thread tying what was happening here to a broader discussion about justice, fairness, and trust in government systems. That story about what really sparked these events and how it connects to other forces at work leads us directly into what happened next. What set the fuse on a federal probe? The moment federal agents arrived in Minneapolis wasn't random. Behind the sudden surge of officers and tactical gear, there were months, even years of careful investigation. Authorities didn't just wake up one morning and decide to flood the streets. They had been tracking patterns, gathering evidence, and following leads that pointed to serious misuse of public resources. While it might have seemed sudden to residents, this was the result of meticulous work, a chain of events that had quietly unfolded behind closed doors for a long time. At the heart of the investigation were allegations that millions, possibly billions, of taxpayer dollars had been misused in programs designed to help families and communities. These weren't minor mistakes or bookkeeping errors. Federal authorities claimed that money intended to feed children, support education, or aid families in need may have been siphoned off through fraudulent means. Every file, receipt, and report was being examined for inconsistencies, and investigators worked tirelessly to map how the funds were being moved and who might have benefited. While officials spoke of fraud, for the people living in Minneapolis, the story felt personal. Families who had relied on federal programs began questioning if their support was in danger. Some wondered whether the programs they depended on would survive this scrutiny, while others worried about what would happen if someone they knew was caught up in the investigation. The mix of fear, uncertainty, and curiosity created a palpable tension that no one could ignore. Investigators explained that fraud often doesn't appear out of nowhere. It usually grows quietly, hidden in plain sight, weaving a network of transactions, claims, and paperwork that looks legitimate at first glance. Tracing this kind of activity requires patience, precision, and an understanding of how people exploit systems that are meant to protect the most vulnerable. In Minneapolis, authorities said they had uncovered patterns that suggested some individuals had systematically taken advantage of federal programs over a long period. The allegations went beyond simple paperwork mistakes. Federal prosecutors pointed to what they described as organized networks designed to move money illegally, hide trails, and avoid detection. Each lead fed into the next, creating a picture that authorities believe justified the large-scale enforcement operation residents witnessed. It wasn't about random arrests or punishing communities. According to officials, it was about following evidence where it led, even if that meant sending hundreds of agents into neighborhoods where everyday life suddenly came to a halt. The operation also raised deeper questions about oversight and accountability. How could such large amounts of money be misused without being noticed sooner? How were programs meant to help communities sometimes exploited? These questions fueled debates among local leaders, community activists, and ordinary residents. People wanted answers, not just headlines. And the operation sparked transparency and the responsibility of both government agencies and individuals in safeguarding public resources. For many, the sudden visibility of federal agents forced a closer look at how complex and interconnected public programs are. What may seem like simple government support can, in reality, involve intricate processes that are vulnerable to manipulation. The Minneapolis case became a window into these systems, showing how even programs with the best intentions could be exploited if oversight fails. At the same time, the operation highlighted the emotional impact of enforcement actions on real people. Parents, grandparents, and children watched as agents moved through streets and neighborhoods, their presence a constant reminder that even large-scale investigations ripple through the daily lives of ordinary citizens. It was a mix of fear, frustration, and cautious hope that justice would be served without harming innocent lives. But the investigation didn't stop at tracing financial mismanagement.
One thing that is clear based on the testimony today is that this is not just a Minnesota problem. This is a warning sign for every state that it is administering large-scale programs using taxpayer dollars.
As authorities dug deeper, they began to uncover a network that seemed more organized than anyone had expected. It wasn't just about missing money. The scale, complexity, and the connections that started appearing hinted at a bigger story, one that linked the fraud patterns to broader systems, showing how deeply certain activities could reach into communities. And this is where the tension starts to rise even further. What began as a look into fraudulent programs was starting to reveal something more intricate, something that would eventually involve multiple layers of connections, surprising twists, and consequences that no one could have predicted. The evidence was pointing toward a hidden web, a puzzle waiting to be untangled, and that's exactly what the next stage of the story would reveal. The real question now became, how had this web been built? Who was involved? And what exactly were the threads that connected the pieces? To answer that, we have to look closer at how the system functioned, how investigators traced each lead, and how patterns emerged that eventually became the backbone of the federal operation. The next chapter uncovers the anatomy of what authorities called the hidden network, the intricate structures, strategies, and connections that made this case both stunning and complex. Inside the shadows of a suspected fraud web. As the investigation unfolded, authorities began to see the full picture of what they called a hidden network operating behind the scenes. It wasn't something obvious or flashy. There were no neon signs pointing to wrongdoing. Instead, it was subtle, hidden in paperwork, claims, and transactions that, at first glance, looked normal. To the outside world, everything seemed fine. To investigators, however, each small irregularity was a thread, and when those threads were pulled together, they formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. This network was complex. It involved layers of activity that moved money, shifted responsibilities, and disguised the true flow of funds. Officials described it as a carefully woven system designed to hide irregularities, making it difficult for anyone outside the operation to notice that something was amiss. Each claim submitted, each document filed, and each interaction with federal programs became a part of a bigger puzzle. It was like a house of cards, stable on the surface, but fragile and easily toppled once the pieces were examined in detail. Investigators also noticed that the network was not isolated. It seemed to touch multiple areas, involving different programs, offices, and organizations. Some patterns pointed to repeated actions over time, suggesting that whoever was behind it understood the system well enough to exploit weaknesses without drawing attention. It wasn't about a single mistake or moment of carelessness. It was about coordination, planning, and an ongoing strategy to move funds in ways that weren't legal. For people watching from the outside, the idea of a hidden system might sound abstract. But to those living in affected communities, it started to feel very real. Families who depended on social programs began to wonder if the system they relied on was safe. Questions that had never seemed urgent about oversight, rules, and accountability suddenly became pressing. People began talking, sharing what they knew, and trying to make sense of how something so hidden could exist in plain sight for so long. The federal investigators described it like tracing a maze. One lead would open another, and one document would point to several more. Agents spent countless hours mapping the movements of money, trying to connect the dots between legitimate claims and fraudulent actions. Each discovery brought them closer to understanding the scope of the operation, revealing connections that suggested coordination across multiple levels. It was an intricate web, built carefully and quietly, with rules known only to those operating inside it. Even though the details were technical, the impact on the city was visible. Businesses, schools, and community programs felt the tension of the investigation. People who had nothing to do with wrongdoing were caught in the ripple effects, uncertain about what would happen next. Parents watched their children, workers wondered if their employment was secure, and neighbors questioned what they thought they knew about those around them. The hidden network, once invisible, now cast a shadow over daily life. The deeper the investigators dug, the more surprising the findings became. It wasn't just isolated incidents of fraud or minor errors. They saw patterns that repeated across time, showing how systems could be manipulated if oversight wasn't tight. The network had multiple layers, and each layer added a new level of complexity. What seemed small at first, a mismatched document here, a claim there, was actually part of a much larger and deliberate structure. And yet, even with all the layers uncovered, the authorities knew they had only begun to understand the full scale. There were still questions about how far the network reached, who was involved at higher levels, and what connections might exist beyond what had already been documented. Each new piece of information suggested a story far bigger than anyone had imagined. The discovery of this network set the stage for the next critical part of the story: how the alleged misuse of resources intersected with broader criminal concerns. Authorities began looking not just at financial mismanagement, but at the ways these patterns could be linked to other illegal activity. While many details were still under investigation, the narrative was clear. What started as a hidden web of fraud had the potential to touch even more areas than anyone had expected. And that leads us to the next chapter. To understand the full picture of why this federal operation shook Minneapolis so profoundly, we need to explore the claims and rumors that sprang up around connections, including the circulation of substances, online speculations, and the broader fallout. The story brings us to the next section, where the lines between verified facts and wild online theories begin to intersect, setting up the dramatic tension that kept everyone on edge. The fentanyl claims fueling online firestorms. As the investigation unfolded, whispers and rumors began spreading fast. Social media lit up with stories claiming connections to substances, secret operations, and dangerous activity lurking in the shadows of Minneapolis. People shared screenshots, forwarded messages, and posted videos speculating about hidden labs, huge halls, and criminal networks. The atmosphere became charged, with curiosity, fear, and disbelief swirling together. But underneath the chatter, the truth was far more grounded than the viral claims suggested. Federal authorities made it clear that the Minneapolis operation was primarily focused on immigration enforcement and investigating alleged financial fraud. While online discussions tried to link the case to substance, cartels, fentanyl trafficking, or other criminal enterprises, official statements did not confirm these claims. In other words, the dramatic headlines that spread like wildfire across social platforms often exaggerated, misinterpreted, or outright fabricated connections. For residents and viewers alike, it became a lesson in separating fact from speculation. Even so, the idea of substances and crime being involved captured people's attention. After all, stories of secret operations, mysterious networks, and hidden danger are compelling. The online narrative painted Minneapolis as a city caught between ordinary life and a shadowy underworld, a storyline that felt intense and cinematic. Every time a new rumor surfaced, it was shared as though it were fact, creating a sense of suspense and fear even where none was verified. For local communities, the viral stories were both fascinating and frightening. Parents worried about their children, shopkeepers questioned who they could trust, and neighbors became hyper-aware of their surroundings. Even people who had no connection to the investigation felt the ripple effects, as conversations shifted from everyday concerns to what might or might not be happening just beyond their doors. The tension was real, even if some of the claims weren't. Federal agents, on the other hand, stayed focused on evidence. They traced financial records, reviewed documents, and followed leads that could be verified. There was no official confirmation of tunnels, cartel leaders, or massive illicit operations tied to the fraud investigation. Instead, what the authorities found was a carefully hidden network designed to misuse funds. This is what made the investigation so complex. It was a serious crime, but one that was hidden in plain sight and easily misinterpreted by the public. The contrast between verified facts and viral speculation created a unique tension. On one hand, residents had to cope with the presence of heavily armed agents and large-scale raids. On the other, online audiences consumed dramatic narratives of substances and organized crime, often without context. For investigators, the challenge was twofold: uncovering the truth while ensuring that the misinformation did not further destabilize communities already feeling anxious. Despite the lack of confirmed substances links, the allegations online continue to gain traction. Social media thrives on mystery, fear, and curiosity, and the story of Minneapolis became a magnet for speculation. Every report, photo, or post that hinted at hidden danger amplified public interest, keeping people glued to screens, wondering what would happen next. In a way, the online frenzy became part of the story itself, a parallel narrative unfolding alongside the official investigation. The investigation's complexity, combined with the viral rumors, set the stage for the most dramatic phase yet: arrests and accountability. Once the network had been traced and evidence compiled, authorities were ready to take action. People began to wonder who would be held responsible, how communities would respond, and what the consequences would be for those allegedly involved. The stakes were high, the tension palpable, and the next chapter promised to bring answers, at least some, to the questions that had gripped Minneapolis for weeks. And that's where the story turns to the next stage. From hidden networks and viral speculation, the investigation now moved to action. The arrests, the fallout, and the ways communities and authorities had to confront what had been uncovered. What happened next would not only reveal the reach of the operation, but also show the real human impact behind every headline and rumor. Arrests, backlash, and the reckoning ahead. The operation in Minneapolis reached its most intense point when federal agents began making arrests. People across the city watched as those identified through months of careful investigation were taken into custody. These arrests weren't random. They were based on evidence tied to fraud and immigration violations.
More than 2,000 immigration arrests have been made since the Department of Homeland Security began its operation in December. These latest raids come in the wake of the fatal shooting of Renee Good in Minneapolis.
Streets that had felt tense and uncertain now became the stage for reality. Law enforcement in action, consequences unfolding from months of hidden activity. The impact on neighborhoods was immediate. Families worried about loved ones, parents kept children close, and communities grappled with fear and relief all at once. Some saw the arrests as justice finally being served, while others questioned fairness, worried about the human toll on innocent people. The city felt a mix of anxiety and hope, showing just how deeply law enforcement actions touch everyday life. Political leaders and community advocates responded with strong opinions. Some criticized the scale of the operation, saying it disrupted daily life and created fear. Others emphasized that accountability was necessary, particularly when public programs meant to help families were being misused. The tension highlighted the delicate balance between enforcing the law and preserving trust and safety within communities. Beyond the arrests, the operation offered lessons about rumor, fact, and perception. Viral stories online had painted dramatic scenarios, hidden networks, cartel activity, and sensational claims. But the verified outcomes centered on fraud and immigration enforcement. This contrast reminded everyone how quickly misinformation can spread and how crucial it is to rely on evidence. As Minneapolis began to process what had happened, communities reflected on trust, oversight, and the ripple effects of federal action. The city was left with answers, but also questions, prompting discussions about reform, accountability, and the human impact of law enforcement. In the end, the story wasn't just about arrests or investigations. It was about the lives affected, the lessons learned, and the work still ahead to rebuild trust and ensure fairness for everyone. The Minneapolis operation revealed hidden fraud and shook communities, but facts matter more than rumors. As the city recovers, questions about accountability, oversight, and trust remain. For more enjoyable videos, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.